Right, well, I'm Nick Childs. I'm the Senior Fellow for Naval Forces Maritime Security here at the IISS, and it's been a great privilege of me to be working with the Naval staff and First Sea Lords team for this year's First Sea Lord Sea Power Conference, which has got off to a great start. I thought we had a terrific first session with a fantastic scanning of the horizon by the Minister and the First Sea Lord. But we are now into our first plenary session, getting into a bit more, even more of the meat of some of the issues that have already been raised from this morning. And the title of the first plenary, Contesting Waters, first part of our discussion on this, calibrating conflict at sea, which is really to look at some of those issues that have been raised. The Minister and First Sea Lord talked about the broad aperture of issues that navies have to confront, from naval diplomacy right up to the high-end elements of war fighting, and perhaps we're going to drill a little bit down on some of those issues, and particularly some of the challenges of resetting for the higher end, and how to balance those. First Sea Lord talked about one of the broad lessons from what we're seeing unfold in Ukraine about state-on-state confrontation, conflict being brutal, and loss is inevitable. That's a sobering construct to start off with in the first place. We have a great panel of discussants for this session, each of whom will make brief opening remarks of 6 to 8 minutes, and that will be followed by a discussion, both from those of you here in Arundel House, but also those who are joining us online will have the option to engage either with the hands raised function or in the Q&A function, and we'll hopefully have a good discussion on the back of the opening remarks, all of which are on the record, as will be the Q&A for this session. So we'll kick off straight away. I've already used up far too much time by introducing our first panelist for this session, Vice Admiral Andy Burns, who is the Fleet Commander, has been so since September 2021. He has a background and specialisms in, well, first in bridge watchkeeping, but fighter control and principal warfare officer. He's had command of Minehunter, HMS Barclay, the frigates, HMS Somerset, and the amphibious assault ship HMS Bulwark, and amongst other things in terms of his more recent senior commands, he was Commander UK Strike Force, which is the Navy's deployable 2-star operational command and Rear Admiral surface ships. Admiral Burns, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nick, for that introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be talking to you this morning. And having listened to the First Sea Lord and the Minister for the Armed Forces, there seem to be some themes emerging, but I don't think there's any harm in a little bit of repetition. And as you heard them emphasize, the war in Ukraine has highlighted the anticipated return of state-on-state conflict. And I say anticipated because the integrated review acknowledged that in an era of constant competition, there could be a rapid shift towards crisis and then conflict. And of course, for the Euro-Atlantic region, the cursor has now moved much closer to the crisis and conflict edge of that particular spectrum. The Royal Navy's response to an era of constant competition has been to adopt a more assertive posture, either individually on a sovereign basis, or in concert with partners and allies. Freedom of navigation operations, or exploiting maritime maneuver, along with deception, and the ability to aggregate and disaggregate forces to put pressure on an adversary, represent a new mentality that pervades our operational thinking and our planning. Part of this mentality is placing all this on a campaign footing, with a strategic outlook that recognizes the interconnectedness of the oceans and our dependence on them for prosperity in a globalized economy. There remain some enduring fundamentals. The pinnacle of our operational output remains the continuous at-sea deterrent, we must retain our ability to defend our waters and protect our overseas dependencies. And we must continue to demonstrate to our allies around the world that we are a reliable partner, capable of contributing to and leading multinational task forces. And that's why our ability to be interchangeable with our allies, and by that I mean beyond routine interoperability, is so important. We've returned to a force posture that has persistent presence as a key outcome, recognizing the differentiation made in the integrated operating concept, our conceptual headmark, between operate and fight. And just think about how exercise Spring Train in 1982 quickly had to shift, maneuvering down to the South Atlantic and then fight. Forward operating allows you to understand the environment and to further partnerships, developing a level of understanding that might be necessary when it comes to offensive operations. Part of this mentality shift is a focus on lethality, although I prefer to broaden this to operational effectiveness, particularly in the context of grey zone or hybrid conflict. In any event, this requires us to think differently, to be genuinely threat-driven, and to be honest about the challenges that might confront us. It requires us to give meaning to the expression multi-domain integration, operating with our colleagues in the other frontline commands and with agencies across government in order to deliver the desired effect. And the pace of change, whether that's in geopolitics or technology, requires us to be genuinely adaptive. And that's what being a reference Navy entails, having an adaptable tactical mentality, at the operational level, having convening power, and offering credible sea power to play a part in statecraft at the strategic level. We have shifted from a focus on peacetime efficiency and on a Navy configured to deliver effect from the sea, now we recognize we have entered a maritime era in which state-on-state competition plays out at sea as much as it does on land. The evolution of the commando force will maintain our edge in the littoral, flexible by design to enable a contribution from discrete tasking to theatre entry. Our submarine fleet continues to operate across the globe, but with a particular focus on maintaining our operational advantage in the North Atlantic. And our surface fleet, the Fleet Air Arm and the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, remains continually active, whether it be an aircraft carrier in the high north, offshore patrol vessels in the Indo-Asia Pacific, frigates in the Gulf, or destroyers in the Mediterranean. The tempo of maritime operations shows no sign of abating. Indeed, I think the opposite is true. And that's why the focus of this conference is timely, as we once again think about war at sea, which, for the foreseeable future at least, will remain a human endeavor enabled by technology. It's our people who deliver on our behalf across the globe every day. The moral component of operational capability is as important as ever. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Lieutenant General Charlie Stickland, Royal Marines, who is Chief of Joint Operations at Permanent Joint Headquarters. Joined the Royal Marines in 1997. His operational experience includes everything, it seems, from the high north to the far east, so very apposite for the global perspectives that we are having to deal with. His time has included operations in Afghanistan, including as commander of 4-2 Commando Group from 2008 to 2009, and he has also served in the capacity not only as Commander UK Amphibious Forces, but concurrently also as Commandant General of the Royal Marines. But for now, General, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. A very good afternoon. I think we're nearly there. It's a great privilege to be talking to you, and I'm going to give a little bit of a sort of joint perspective, I think, to some of the comments that we've played through as we go forward. And also I sort of picked the phrase of calibrating conflict at sea and the issue of how do we deal with pacing threats as a little bit of a theme as I take us through. So to calibrating, it could not be more pertinent to the current crisis. Now, of course, Ukraine sits at the very heart, but actually the UK, aligned with NATO, but also bilateral relationships, microlateral relationships, and multilateral relationships, we have actually been doing joint operations from the Berings to the Bab el-Mandeb. all the way, a swathe of activity in the Euro-Atlantic and beyond. And the approach has very definitely been with many partners. And I'm quite pleased that the ministers are now taking on the bumper sticker I gave the Jeff of the beer drinking nations of the North. And actually it was in Hansard last week, which is I've made it. But using those bilateral, multilateral and NATO relationships, what we sought to be is to deliver a more proactive and assertive, but calibrated posture. And that's been really, really important. And I think the little bit of my bit here, the theme is the power of combinations. Littoral and maritime maneuver has been a critical part of this approach. And the big phrases have been get a bigger map. Ukraine, hugely important, and we in the Plenary Joint Headquarters are working really hard to galvanize the support and operate. But also thinking more broadly is really, really important. Physically, virtually and cognitively. And so we've been looking at operating in multiple domains, creating multiple threat vectors and creating an opportunity for strategic dilemmas. And that offers strategic choice and it offers political choice. And you can dial up and dial down, but you have to think about how you actually construct this as an operational design from the very outset. So as a little example, in Nick's think piece he published before this conference, he talked about cold response, a hugely important endeavor with my Norwegian colleague running an exercise for 30,000 people, a huge maritime contribution. But after that, we broke away and put Prince of Wales North up towards Iceland with Danes, with Norwegians and other assets from the coalition. Concurrently, we're operating with our Jeff partners in the Baltic Sea, with a very much a statement from them, which is this is our sea. And concurrently, we've been playing through the movement of land capability up into Finland, which is just deployed as we're going at the moment. So trying to keep a tapestry of activity and the maritime being fundamental in all of that activity. But I think crucially, not just the maritime. So advanced forces, cyber forces, commando forces, special capabilities, and importantly, information activity and operations. So Andrew mentioned the sort of persistent engagement to warfighting. I like to think of it in the 3 C's, from competition through crisis into conflict. And when you're starting to think about pacing threats and you're starting to think about calibrating at sea, I think a really important piece of the jigsaw is transition to conflict, because it brings lots of questions into this debate about sea power. Because I think there's a really big question about how are you going to fight? And I think maritime power has a huge contribution with the power of combinations to play in activity left of the bang. You can shape the battle space, you can deter, but you can transfer to dilemmas at multiple levels. You can seek to unhinge your adversary, but you can also shift from crisis to conflict in a very, very seamless but unpleasant way. So to my point is that to conclude this short bit, we as naval officers must stop talking about navies. And we must talk about the power of combinations. Good examples, intelligence, hugely powerful on CSG 21. The fusion of both all source and above secret activity absolutely allowed Steve Morehouse to be more agile with the Russian dynamics that played around him off Cyprus when he was working in the Eastern Mediterranean. Also, helping the Second Sea Lord, you don't have to keep jets at deck alert for burning and turning and burning out F-35 engines when you actually understand what's going on around you. So there's a combination playing out there. Defenders' legal actions in the Black Sea, and Jonathan's obviously here, but was supported by space activity and was supported by information operations and activity, the power of combinations. Brad Cooper, the admiral who runs Bahrain, from an American perspective, is looking at some really exciting things with a thing called Task Force 59 and autonomy. And he's got sail drones, and we're linked into that and trying to work out how we actually use physical presence, then autonomous presence, and how you network those together actually to have a far greater impact on the global commons, the power of combinations. And I would reflect that the OPVs have really, really been brilliant in the Indo-Asia Pacific already, because they've been pitched at the right level. And my mates in Australia and New Zealand have said, you've actually got it right, UK. You haven't come blustering in, you've talked to us, you've worked out how to work with us. And actually, that Tonga incident, we put the OPV under a New Zealand task force commander, which is again about being a partner, not necessarily a leader, the power of combinations. So to conclude, the idea of a pacing threat, I think we need to look very across the spectrum. And I think again, for the Ukraine crisis, it's actually shown very, very clearly that we do need to think in the DIME paradigm: diplomacy, information, the military, and economics, because that power of combinations is incredibly important. And we need to think about it now. It's not something you flick on a button and suddenly you can change things. We have to think about that competition all the way through. Offset, focused, and spooky, as the Minister of the Armed Forces said. So for me, it's agencies and allies. It's men and women in the shadows. It is land-based and air and carrier-based air. It is advanced and commando forces, and. But it's about trying to break into our adversary's system of systems and use our power of combinations, you could call it integrated action if you were doctrinally pure, to deliver the effects and the outcomes that we seek into the future. Thank you very much indeed.
General, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Alessio Catalano, who's Professor of War and Strategy in East Asia in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. He was originally a military historian of Japan, but has ranged further in the Indo-Pacific region and ranges further still in terms of his analysis across the spectrum. He's a prolific author amongst other things, and his forthcoming book is due out in later this year, I think. Yes. With a stimulating title of The New Age of Naval Power in the Indo-Pacific. So that is going to be become a reference book, I think, for the future, at least from the title. But anyway, Alessio, your turn now to take the stage and your thoughts on the exam question, as it were.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nick. Firstly, Lord Admirals, flag officers, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you in this conversation today. Contested sea control is back. That seems to be clear. But what I'll try to do with my 8 minutes is to try to cast a wider net to understand how the character of such contestation is changing. I would argue that the importance of sea control to international affairs and its peacetime counterpart as freedom of the seas has changed in two significant ways. First, in regard of how maritime theaters are central, are key to international order and balance of power. And second, concerning the expansion of peacetime forms of coercion. The former point highlights how high-intensity warfighting should be considered as the benchmark against which navies that intend to empower their governments with the ability to shape the peace and raise to the task in war need to fashion themselves. The latter implies that peacetime activities are crucial not just in preventing war and shaping security, but they are also essential to ensure one is ready for as much as one can be for conflict if and when war becomes a reality. During the last quarter of the century, the stability of the ocean facilitated by Western maritime dominance defined the growth of trade and freedom in a global sense. Today's economic prosperity rests on shipping for physical connectivity and underwater sea cables for digital connectivity. Throughout this period, emerging powers like China have drawn upon the advantages of global connectivity to establish themselves. Yet, as China established itself economically, it also came to understand that the ocean was a vast maneuver space that international coalition were leveraging to project power ashore in expeditionary and stabilization campaigns. Elites of Beijing came to recognize in the maritime order a key place where the challenge to the established balance of power should be taken. This challenge today starts in the East and South China Seas, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, but as a weaker Russia embraces Beijing to regain status and relevance, regardless of how the current conflict ends. This raises a very interesting question about how the Arctic, the Indian Ocean, and the South Atlantic link the strategic, conventional, and strategic balance of power of the Atlantic area to the Indo-Pacific in unprecedented ways. In other words, for the first time, major powers, established, status quo oriented, rising, revisionist, you name them. They all see their ability to influence affairs at sea as a getaway to change the order and balance on land in a Courbetian sense. This is why sea power is central to competition about the international order. My second point about how it changed is that contestation at sea now is much more of a prominent feature of peacetime activities as well. The emergence of UNCLOS as the main framework to expand state sovereignty at sea has led in the early 2000s, especially after 9/11, to cooperative forms of behavior to ensure maritime security against transnational threats and to governance and good order. However, by the early 2010s, the states, notably in the East and the South China Seas, were contesting claims to assert their own maritime rights and interests. Whilst naval diplomacy in its coercive manifestation is as old as navies, this new form of coercion, coercive behavior was altogether quite different. This behavior was not part of a common rule book for the conduct of the business of international politics. It was deployed to change the rule book itself. It was about competition over the existing international order. As a result, peacetime activities are today much less peaceful and have transformed defense engagement into naval campaigns. Admiral Burns just talked about it moments ago. Of no less relevance, I think this peacetime competition speaks to national sovereignty and projection of power that sets the foundation for revisionist powers to contest sea control in wartime. An artificial military outpost in the South China Sea is not merely a coercive peacetime marker about a claim. It is a down payment to contest the sea control in war. Indeed, if anything, the Russian experience in the Black Sea seems to be suggesting and confirming that denial capabilities have a say in places close to contested shores. There are three implications about the future of naval warfare unfolding from the above. First, at the strategic level, contested regional areas in key maritime theaters matter to the stability of the international order. Thus, peacetime shaping of security should also aim at preparing for war fighting, from the fostering of ISR to partners' capacity building to developing interchangeability with allies. Here, I think the Arctic, High North, and the Indo-Pacific theaters are crucially important for a country with global ambitions such as Britain. Second, at the operational level, constraints on national warfighting capabilities are likely to demand greater efforts in partnerships capable of creating military effect. Again, for a country like Britain, this will demand a capacity to operationally convene when needed and militarily enable operational effectiveness when leading is not necessary or not desirable. Crucially, the ability to prioritize capabilities on the basis of a relevant assessment of the importance of a specific theater to national security against the specific theater's key security challenges might prove to be a relevant way to guide the management of limited resources. Third and final point, at the tactical level, navies like the Royal Navy will have to instill, foster, nurture, and continue to do so a mentality that rewards an understanding of the real possibility of war fighting and its implication in contemporary affairs. Such a mental attitude is essential to maximize the focus and effects of peacetime engagements, to inspire and reassure partners, and for the Royal Navy to define what it means to be Europe's foremost naval power, so that we don't get into the sort of French, sort of British competition thing. For lethality to be truly distributed, it has to start in the mind of each ship captain and their crews, no matter how big or small the asset is. This might very well be a good way to ensure that the risk of contested sea control remains a little less of a risk in this age of systemic competition. These are hard times, but we all know that the kite flies higher against the wind. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alessio. So our final panelist for this session is Dr. Sarah Kirschberger, who is the head of Asia Pacific Strategy and Security at the Institute for Security Policy at the University of Kiel. And I hope she, apart from anything else, should perhaps bring the perspective of how reflecting on events that we have seen and have already been referenced today, how these might be perceived from a Beijing and a People's Liberation Army Navy perspective, not least amongst the perspectives that we perhaps need to think about. She, like Alessio, is a prolific author, and one of her main works, which is I think a reference piece and a reference book for scholars of China's naval power, is Assessing China's Naval Power, Technological Innovation, Economic Constraints and Strategic Implications, which was published in 2015. She's been a very prominent commentator on the further developments of the Chinese Navy and maritime power since then. And with that perspective, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick. And First Sea Lord, Admiral, flag officers, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to conclude the remarks in this panel with a couple of reflections on what this war that we're seeing means for China, for deterrence in the Western Pacific, essentially, but also what it implies for the future of the Russia-China strategic partnership or quasi-alliance that we've been seeing unfold over the past couple of years. And also, of course, the question is interesting: how will China probably be calibrating its own ideas of conflict at sea following the invasion of Ukraine? So first, despite some obvious differences in geography and other factors, this war has considerable implications for the one key mission that the PLA Navy is training for, and that to a large extent defines its purpose, its reason for existing, and that is capturing the island of Taiwan. So the effect on Beijing of this war in Ukraine and how it did not go well for the Russian invader was considerable. From what I've been hearing coming out of China from colleagues and observers, this has caused considerable confusion in Beijing, profound shock indeed. So according to what I hear, there's a flurry of activity of analyzing the implications and what this all means. China probably expected Russia to be successful in this invasion very, very quickly, maybe within a couple of days. And it also expected the West to be divided and undecisive in the face of this Russian aggression. And had things unfolded in the expected way, this might then have created a very dangerous situation where this would have encouraged, most likely, Russia to go even further, and China perhaps also to become more inclined towards military adventurism in the Western Pacific. Fortunately for all of us, things went very different than expected, mostly thanks to the heroic resistance of the Ukrainians. Let's consider the context of this whole event for a moment. So Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have been convincing both themselves and each other for a couple of years now of a narrative of an inevitability of Western decline. So they have been looking at the world, thinking about a new world order that they want to create, a multipolar world composed of great powers that exercise exclusive influence, dominate their near abroad, and have peripheries basically that they can dominate. They call this the democratization of international relations, in contrast to a system of hegemony. So the first shock in that sense for China, I think, came before this war in the form of the AUKUS Pact, because this pact or this agreement basically showed that a smaller power such as Australia that had been sitting on the fence about China for many, many years was now ready to swing and align itself decisively against Chinese interests. So this was maybe the first signal, and I'm convinced that it was interpreted in that way in Beijing, that China had a bit overplayed its hand in trying to coerce countries before it had actually the power to do so successfully. So prematurely behaved like the dominant great power in its region, and thereby creating a backlash of rather epic proportions, I would say. So Russia and China, in their shared opposition to the West, grew ever more closely in the years leading up to this war, and they actually reaffirmed the closeness of this relationship just in early February this year, so right before the war started. And Russia has long been China's, of course, most important source of military technology, including naval technology. One should not forget to mention that Ukraine too has been a very important source of some extremely important technology, such as the Liaoning aircraft carrier, Hull, and a couple of other things. But China has, I think, therefore, very much shocked by the bad military performance of Russia, also in terms of the equipment failures, not just the morale of the Russian troops. So the sinking of the Moskva, of course, implies that the survivability of China's own high-end assets in the event of a kinetic conflict might be a little bit less sure than China perhaps had convinced itself before. Some of these assets were actually built in the same shipyard as the Moskva in Mykolaiv. So that would be one of the important lessons that I'm pretty sure will influence the Chinese risk calculus and will also prompt some improvements on the side of the Chinese naval planners. So the strength of the Ukrainian resistance itself, of course, has an important meaning for a potential invasion of Taiwan. It inspires the Taiwanese, but it also gives caution to China not to expect an easy victory against this sea fortress, as Taiwan has been called recently by its foreign minister. And then the sanctions, the Western sanctions, they were also something that shocked Beijing because of this newfound unity and resolve of the West. Pretty sure I am, as someone who was based in Germany, that Germany was seen as something of the weak link in NATO probably, and also in the EU, maybe expected to use its veto power to block a decisive response. So that was probably a real shock in Beijing and in Moscow to see this not happening. So this shows that the costs of the economic and political costs alone, not even speaking of the military cost of such an adventure, are huge and not to be underestimated. By contrast to Russia, however, China usually prefers tactics that dominate a region by numerical superiority, using paramilitary, civilian, and military vessels in a layered formation, trying to pit its own strength against a weaker opponent. So actual peer-to-peer kinetic conflict is something that perhaps runs a little bit against traditional Chinese concepts of good military strategy. So therefore, we must be very grateful for the Ukrainians to reinforce this notion that underestimating the enemy is the key danger to avoid. We have some interesting conclusions also to draw in terms of the overly strong reliance on military technology versus human beings in the military. So the Chinese military can be expected to have a lot of the same weaknesses in organizational terms and in overly strong reliance on technology that the Russian army has. Also, corruption is a huge problem in the Chinese armed forces. We do not really know how well Chinese shipboard electronics, for instance, work. That's a bit of a black box for open source analysts. So some of the claimed capabilities, they may be there, but who knows how well they perform if under stress in a conflict situation. So there might be some surprises to be seen in the event of conflict. And I think China will be evaluating the implications of these risks. So the key for the future moving forward and looking to what could happen for us is to keep deterring China from risking conflict by influencing the Chinese risk calculus. So we are basically doing very well right now. The Ukrainians deserve the most credit, definitely. So we all have reason to say Slava Ukraini and to wish them success. But we can all contribute to this deterrence across the whole board of political, economic, and military costs that could be incurred by China through adventurism. And I think Russia will become vastly less attractive a partner as a result of its miscalculation and its strategic failure in Ukraine to China. It will become a dominated, smaller partner in this partnership. And the likelihood of actual conflict erupting in the Western Pacific has, I think, for the foreseeable near-term future really grown much, much smaller because of what we've been seeing in Ukraine. So that would be some observations. Thank you very much.
Sarah, thank you very much, particularly for your concluding thoughts in your presentation, and the sense in which some of the things that you suggest might be giving pause for thought in Beijing as far as the maritime is concerned. We are now open to the discussion session, the question and answer session. So we have about half an hour or so for discussion. So please do let me know in the room if you have any interventions or questions you'd like to put to the panelists. Likewise, in terms of our virtual audience, our online audience, you have the option either of the question and answer function to put a question, or a raised hand if you'd like directly to put your question verbally to one or other of the panelists. I will identify who you are and will unmute your microphone from here. I'm going to kick off the discussion with a general point, I think, for all the panelists, and I think particularly Admiral and General in talking about your perspectives on having to look at the spectrum of what is required in a particular maritime, but in a joint sense as well, from the lower end contingencies that one is reflecting on and having to deal with, right up to war fighting, and human engagement with technology assistance is still the order of the day, you say, and adaptability must be the mindset in many ways. Adaptability, yes, but aren't there choices in that sort of graduation of both commitment but also readiness that one has to deal with in terms of friction issues around looking at the lower end up to the higher end? Doesn't that mean you have to make choices at some point, and where the balance of choice may or may not be shifting as a result of the recent events? So I'll sort of go down the line, I think, with Fleet Commander first to kick off.
Thanks, Nick. I think the thought that first comes to mind is, and this is building a bit on Charlie's point about the power of combinations, the great advantage that the Royal Navy has is that it has 5 fighting arms. So it has a surface fleet, a submarine fleet, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, the Royal Marines, and the Fleet's Air Arm. And it's the combinations that you can deliver across those fighting arms, which I think is so powerful. Then when you combine that with our Army and Air Force colleagues, you're already getting to a point where you're offering an extraordinary range of choice to ministers, and also an extraordinary range of effects that you can deliver from and at the sea. Then there's the multinationality aspect, and then there's the sort of cross-government and agency combinations that you can put together. And then again, you're multiplying the effect and you're multiplying the choices that you can offer commanders and decision makers. And I think that's the great advantage that navies have, is because they are flexible in the combinations that can be delivered. I think also there's a command and control point here, and really looking at command and control as a capability. And that again is the combination of human factors as well as the technology that might lead to faster and better decision making, whether that's at sea or whether that's through reach back ashore. But we also, I think, have to be mindful of the fact we have to be ready to fight in a denied environment. And that's why mission command, which is the basis upon which we conduct operations, is so important as well. Have we given enough intent and enough direction to our subordinate commanders to act with instinct without further direction from a hierarchy? And again, that is part of this moral component, that sort of level of understanding in subordinate commanders that is necessary to be effective.
I pick up on two bits. I think the mission command one is really, really powerful because it's about the two things that sit behind it are trust and mutual understanding. And that comes to training, that comes to your people. And I think there's some really good, interesting lessons from Ukraine about distributed and delegated operations that are going on at the moment, just to reinforce Andy's point. The point I think I'd pick up on this one is your point about the spectrum. I think also we mustn't convince ourselves that you can go everywhere and be everywhere and not think about readiness and think about integration. So I'll use Carrier Strike Group 21 as an example because we all worked on it very closely. But that the reason that we could then disaggregate the forces and have multiple effects in multiple places was because it was properly worked up. It was properly worked up with our international partners, with the F-35 force, Everton in, Americans in, actually worked out with an American carrier group before we actually sailed, which was a Herculean effort during COVID. But then it meant you could actually then disaggregate and have this idea of lots of points of presence. And so I think the power of a naval force is the ability to aggregate and disaggregate at pace. But we mustn't convince ourselves we can't do it. We have to make sure you do the integration, and then there's a half-life to that integration.
Alessio?
Very briefly, building on this last point, there's the question about what, right, that you asked, needs to be sort of complemented by the where. So where do we do things? Not all theatres will present the same conditions and will demand therefore the same thing. And so unfolding from that, I think what part of the question, and this is linking to the second bit of the answer to the first bit, is the extent to which to maximize effectiveness, working with others and also understanding the priority list in terms of mission to prioritize and capabilities to assign, so that you mitigate whatever limits that you might have on the what by prioritizing, where and the type of missions that you're doing. Perhaps the question to ask is how to think about forward operating also command and control functions. Because at the moment, for example, if you're the UK, most of it operates from here, from the UK. So the key question is, are there theatres? And I think about the Indo-Pacific as a maritime-centric theatre. So it's a theatre that will demand that maritime integration that's been spoken about to be central to the way in which the country presents itself in whatever format working with allies. Is there a question there to ask about developing a command structure that has that forward element and is the filter between what operationally and tactically happens and what the policy element of decision-making needs to happen in London? You need to have a middle place that harvests the information and allows then London to have the option to prioritize and task and evolve the missions. Because if there's one thing that, Operation Fortress was a great success, but it also took an awful lot of time of planning to be a success. So how do we make that as nimble and as adaptive as you suggested, as the first Sea Lord this morning suggested to us?
Thanks. Admiral Bondier, did you have a point to make, or it was a question? Okay, well, let's have the question for Admiral Bondier in the front row, please.
Thank you for all you are describing a big systemic confrontation between two political economical models. The stake is very high, and so the coordination is something which is the core. My question is, what level of strategic coordination we need to enforce? And my question, the example point is AUKUS. The very day AUKUS was launched was the day where European Union was revealing its Indo-Pacific strategy, and the effect of AUKUS on French posture in the Pacific was to weaken it. And the winner of this was China. In somehow they got they lost Australians, but they won French somehow by the way things were posted on. And so it's time where we spend time from this event. But so do we need to more coordinate than compete between ourselves to face that kind of new threat? That's my question.
I think that was aimed more towards our academic panelists. Alessio, do you want to?
Shall we get Sarah first to start? Do you want to go first? No, I can go first.
I can go first.
Go for it.
Yeah, as an outsider to the AUKUS drama, I would say. My observation would be, of course, I agree with you that coordination among the Western allies is key. So especially after the Ukraine war. However, in the case of AUKUS, it's very hard to see how this could have been coordinated. I think, yeah, I used to work in the naval shipbuilding industry before, and I have seen how these large deals, you know, how they come about and how they work, how they are worked for, how they unfold over years. And looking at it from this more practical perspective, I do not see how the blow could have been softened without endangering AUKUS itself. So if France had been given advanced knowledge, it would have necessarily tried to do whatever it could to stop AUKUS from happening and used every lever it would have had. So I think in the interest of those who wanted to bring AUKUS about, it was probably imperative to keep France in the dark. So just saying this from the outside, it was no doubt not intended to hurt France or humiliate France. That was probably not the intent, but there was just, you know, this decision to be made. Do we want this or do we not want this? And the moment you go for something like that, you know you have to incur a certain cost, and it happened to be this cost. That would be my outside perspective on this particular thing.
Just to add, and sort of specifically the point you raised about the rollout, could the rollout have been better? Yes. But how much one should take away from the fact that it happened on the same day of the unveiling of the European Union maritime strategy? Let me give you another example. Back in 7th of July 2012, the Japanese government announced that it was going to proceed to purchase the islands, the disputed islands, known in Japan as Senkaku, and under Japanese administrative control, and known in China as Diaoyu. And they announced that, and the concern of the Japanese government was at the time, how can we diffuse what was at that point an emerging sort of tension? And they tried to work out all the sort of mechanics on how to present the thing so the way that the Chinese would not be upset. And they were so focused on the content that they forgot that 7th of July, if you're Chinese and the Japanese are announcing something about territorial disputes, not the best day to do it, because it's the beginning of the Japanese upscaling or the sort of on mainland China back in the 1930s. So despite their best efforts, they forgot to check that particular detail. And in fact, all they obtained was that the Chinese were furious. And in fact, the content of the announcement were lost in translation. So my point is, I think perhaps we need to give ourselves a bit of a slack in the sense that sometimes things will happen. We try to make the best effort to do it right. And you can make an argument that in case of AUKUS, the rollout was not entirely that right. But I think we need to leave ourselves, we need sort of to be mindful of the fact that sometimes, even if we try to give our best shot, we might actually not come out with the intended consequences. So where does the difference sort of comes about? I think it's in the underlying development of a fundamental trust that comes with an overarching strategic framework with a degree of convergence, whether it is political MOUs, whether it is talking among chiefs. That is how you start planting the seeds and for that sustainable capacity to work together. That is more important than the politics of the day, because as I say, that might always be a particular element that you haven't thought about, and on that day will make things look really, really bad. But if you have an underlying level of trust, which is built every day, which is built on the back of that strategic convergence that is created on the back of reciprocal sharing of worldviews on a regular fashion, I think you have relationships that can withstand that.
I mean, I'd like to sort of look ahead, really. I think one of the deductions from the current crisis is the degree of alignment we have seen in some of our allegiances and alliances. If you look at the way NATO has evolved over the last few months, the fact that all the graduated response plans were activated, the agreement of 30 nations, I'm not sure we really thought we'd be in that place a few months ago. The Joint Expeditionary Force presenting another option with Sweden and Finland now on the brink of joining NATO as well. And this is the role of politicians and diplomats, to try and seek some sort of alignment. But my goodness, we've achieved that over the last few months in NATO and the GEF, and even with the EU, for a country that now sits outside the EU. So I think that's extraordinary. But navies have a role to play here as well, and that's why being forward deployed and being persistently present, I think, is so important, because you generate that degree of mutual understanding and you provide a mechanism for that alignment when it's needed.
And all I would say, Admiral, is from your point of view, we need to cooperate more. Absolutely. I think this drives us to multilateralism, particularly in the Indo-Asia Pacific, because if we're all honest, there is a resource issue, which none of us have enough resources. So how, again, do we make sure that we don't have one asset going to a particular country and doing some training and then somebody arriving the next week doing the same thing or something different? There's a massive opportunity to link things together. I think Shangri-La Dialogue in June, I think some of the sidebars around that, trying to actually cohere activity from a multilateral perspective in the short term is, and into the future, is absolutely what we need to do.
Thanks very much, all. We've had a few questions come in from our virtual audience. I'm going to group a couple together. One from Larissa Brown of the Times, specifically for Admiral Burns and General Stickland, which is: are there any lessons to be learned from the sinking of the Moskva? It's already been mentioned this morning. And I'll link that with one from Dr. David Blagden of Exeter University to Sarah Kirschberger, also about Moskva, which is, should there be Moskva lessons that are more concerning for China or for Western powers? After all, a major platform attempting to project into the littoral in the face of shore-based anti-ship missiles, ? China versus Taiwan, or does it apply more in the context of of us versus China, or the West versus China? So maybe Admiral and General Stickland first.
Yeah, I mean, I think our sort of analysis of that particular incident looks at the whole of the kill chain from start to finish, and certainly the sort of positioning of that platform. So I think there are some deductions we can make, but I don't think we should read too much into that particular incident. But we ought to be asking questions about why that platform was positioned there, what knowledge did they have of the threat that may or may not emerge, what was their preparation to deal with that threat, and how did they deal with the aftermath of that? Those are all sort of interesting questions for us to ask in analysing their readiness and their capability. So no doubt there'll be more analysis on that front. But I think it also points to the advantages of maritime manoeuvre, and how we should be seeking to manoeuvre our forces in a position where you have a fight at sea on your own terms rather than on the terms of the adversary. And I think that's, again, one of the great advantages that navies have. And whether that's in an aggregated form or a disaggregated form, you can create the conditions for advantage yourself rather than put you in a position where you present a vulnerability.
I would say, because there's all sorts of bits around it, and of course we're analysing, that will be the first point, is you can draw lots of false conclusions from it, but you can absolutely draw some really useful things in terms of how operations happen in the littoral and how you play those out. So one, absolutely, we're looking at it and trying to draw the right conclusions from it. The second point I would say is really just emphasises, is not see this as an isolated incident. And actually, how do you mitigate against that threat, or how do you essentially enable yourself to operate in a threat environment of that nature? That is by the use of advanced forces, that is by the use of cyber, that is by the use of proxies, that is by recognizing that is a threat, and therefore it's task group activity, but it is also joint and combined activity, which means you shape the battle space. And therefore, it comes back to my point about the power of combinations. And the real thing was that was an asset operating in isolation, and there are lots of other things about it, but which created its risk profile. Thank you.
Sarah?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think the incident with the Moskva does have some important implications. For instance, for a Taiwan scenario, Taiwan also has some very advanced missile capabilities and are developing more, and definitely it's an asset for Taiwan to be able to hold that threat to the Liaoning or China's other capital warships. So that's something that Taiwan should in particular look into. And another issue is, of course, there should perhaps for all navies now be a focus on survivability aspects of their ships, because
my feeling is that in some navies, that is an issue that has been a bit neglected. The Chinese Navy, for instance, they have been building ships at an incredible pace for the past couple of years. But the question is, how good are these vessels able to actually withstand a fight, or how could they survive being hit? There are some question marks about that. So in the past, the Chinese Navy did not necessarily make the impression on observers that that was their main focus, maybe better on the newer hulls, but my guess is that the psychological effect alone is very valuable, because it's such a huge symbolic loss to have one of your capital ships sunk like that. I mean, Russia tried to deny that the Moskva was hit. It tried to deny that it actually sank. And then it found all kinds of silly excuses why it sank, and claimed that everyone was rescued aboard and so on. So this shows how much of a blow to a propaganda of such a state that is. And I have been seeing discussions of that coming out of China in terms of how secure are our aircraft carriers. And yeah, I mean, it's been a long discussion, how can you effectively protect a carrier these days, not just against missiles, but in particular also about against submarines. So in that sense, all of these capabilities combined are very important parts of the deterrent posture in the Western Pacific.
Thanks very much. We're coming up against our scheduled time, but because we started late, I think I'll bust into the lunch period a little bit, but I'll group some questions together. And a couple, I think, particularly for Admiral Burns and General Stickland. One from Commodore AJ Singh from India, which is about the deployment of CSG 21 into the Indo-Pacific, a very visible manifestation of post-Brexit, global Britain, and the significance of the Indo-Pacific. The UK has committed a permanent OPV presence to the region, but what are the other areas that are being considered in terms of enhancing particularly maritime domain awareness and tackling the wide spectrum of transnational and non-traditional threats in and around the region? So there's that, but there's also from both to demonstrate our international audience, but also the dedication of some people. Professor Jeffrey Till, who's at the US Naval War College, who's obviously got up very early to be with us today, who's asking, I think particularly to you two, that there's been a lot of references to the importance of the human element in naval power. Is this not likely to be critical in the allocation of forces between competing areas of the world, and therefore do we need more people and more people at sea? For Sarah, there's a question from Jeffrey Mount Evans about, could you say a bit more about the capabilities and development of the Chinese Coast Guard and Chinese ambition for that, and what role will the Chinese fishing fleet have, both including in terms of power projection and influence projection? And Alessia, I don't know, you might want to chip in on the broader Indo-Pacific questions, but Admiral and General Stickland, perhaps first on the maritime domain awareness and in the Indo-Pacific, and do we need more people spread more widely, more quickly?
Yeah. So let's start with CSG 21 and the impact that had in the Indo-Asia Pacific. And for me, this comes back to our instinctive ability to disaggregate and aggregate, to have widespread effect across a large geographical area in order to understand better the operating environment, but also to increase our maritime domain awareness. And actually, that's exactly what our persistently present batch 2 offshore patrol vessels are now delivering. So I saw Trent for myself in the Gulf of Guinea, working with maritime agencies, not just the navies of that particular region. Tamar and Spey are operating with fishing organizations to counter illegal fishing, which has such an impact on the economies in that region. And the same goes for Medway in the Caribbean, not just dealing with illegal fishing, but also conducting counter narcotics operations, again, with partners and allies in the region. So that is increasing our maritime domain awareness. That's exactly the purpose why we have placed our batch to APVs where we have. On people, we need the right number of people for the fleet that we have designed. And we are adopting a number of different systems of crewing our platforms, which gives stability to our people, but also a degree of resilience and a degree of flexibility in the way we operate those platforms. So our batch to APVs, for instance, are multi-crewed, so we can leave our platforms in a particular place and rotate the crews through. Montrose has been in the Middle East for 3 years, adopting a similar model. These are very popular crewing models for the future, and the Type 31 frigate will adopt a similar approach. And of course, as we now understand better what the future fleet looks like, one of the considerations is what number of people do we need for that future fleet, and it needs to be calibrated accordingly.
I'll pick up on Commodore Singh's point about illicit networks and essentially broader maritime security, maritime domain awareness. And he's answered the crewing thing very eloquently. It's his business. I think there's an issue of joining up the dots is the best way I describe this. And the approach we've taken this year started by Admiral Ben when he was doing my job with Indo-Asia Pacific after Carrier Strike 21 was one of measure. So actually our approach should be allies and understanding. And I think that's been really played out really nicely, but it's also the joining up of the dots because there are economic players here from an ASEAN perspective. There's the Five Powers Defence Agreement. There's maritime domain awareness stuff going on in Singapore. There's the Coalition Maritime Force out of Bahrain linking to the Indian Ocean. So what we're seeking to do is as around those OPVs, but is actually say, how can we help with the forces that are based in Brunei more? How can we link with other partners and create essentially an architecture of cooperation? And we are involved in the Pacific Future Forum, the Pacific Partnership with a Mercy ship sailing from San Diego but last week. And there are all of these touch points which you can actually start to build better together. So there's an opportunity there to join dots.
And you mentioned those various elements of the tapestry. There's the littoral response group south as well that's in there somewhere. I mean, how does that fit into that mix and perhaps that people question as well? It'd be nice to hear a little bit more about that.
Do you want to pick on that?
Do you mean how we're going to crew the littoral response group? I mean,
what sort of role it might play in that region and those areas? And
yeah, so again,
is that a way of bringing more?
I think there's choice about where we position the littoral response group, and this is one of the transitions that the Navy is now pursuing, and it's a capability transition for the future commanding force. So, but this does offer choice and flexibility. So you could put it in the Indo-Asia Pacific, you could put it in the Middle East, or you could put it in the Mediterranean. This is the great advantage of the ability to maneuver a task group, whether it's a littoral response group or a carrier strike group around the oceans.
There's a really interesting thing about people, because we do, as a service, talk about platforms a lot, don't we? But actually, people are a capability in of themselves. So some of the things we're doing in the Indo-Asia Pacific, for example, this year is commando engineers supporting humanitarian activity. We've got short-term training teams from the Royal Marines building relationships that then the littoral response group may plug into if that's the choice of where it goes. And we've actually used dark blue short-term training teams in many other places that can have a catalytic effect with partners, not necessarily necessitating a platform. So I think there's another people dimension to it as well, which is also really powerful.
Okay. Alessio, do you have anything to add on the general points?
Yes. 3 quick points, because I know that we are what stands between you and your lunch. So I'll very briefly. Number one, people. You need to build up your regional expertise. Institutional memory has been built and it's been described with the activities of the OPVs and all the other bits and bobs that one has already deployed in the region. But you need to sort of start thinking about the future. How do you sustain that system? How do you start sort of getting accustomed to the fact that every single engineer, every single OPV is part of a bigger picture? How do you ensure that those who are operating out there have a basic understanding of that bigger picture? That's my line of work. And I'm not trying to sell what we do. but you need to start thinking about how to institutionalize that regional expertise. What does it mean, and at what different levels you do different layers, if you want, of education in that respect, with the in light of the practical experience that's been built at the moment. The second point about the Coast Guards and the PLA, the Coast Guard should be, and militia needs to be sort of thought about as a fully integrative and the integrated component of the Chinese military machinery. And certainly within the so-called First Island Chain and East and South China Seas, the Coast Guard and the militias are designed to do the job that in most other places Navy would perform, so that the PLAN can train and do other stuff. And we need to think about this all as one bigger package that operates in a very synergetic fashion, which leads to my last point. We need to be careful about drawing too much of an analogy between or comparisons between the Russian and the Chinese Navy. The Chinese Navy started very low, and 15 years ago, you visited a ship, as it happened to me, and it wouldn't have any sort of conceptual approach to damage control in a modern contemporary sense. The latest platform are very different, and to the best of my understanding, they manned and operate in a very different way. They are learning very fast. That's what they do. The 2021 big exercise with the Russians was one of the first exercises in which the Chinese not only took the lead, but they also provided some of the capabilities that the Russians used as part of the exercise. So in that sense, I think we need to be careful in sort of comparing or looking at Russian experience and say, oh, are we overestimating the Chinese? Because the Chinese have a dynamism that the Russians haven't had for a long time. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks. And Sarah, on the other agencies of China.
On the Coast Guard in particular, it is a very large force. So China has now the largest, numerically speaking, in terms of number of hulls, the largest Navy, the largest Coast Guard, the largest shipping fleet, the largest distant water fishing fleet. So they have really the numbers. And the Coast Guard, I think it's interesting to pick up what Alessio just said, how the Coast Guard, the maritime militia, which is basically weaponized fishermen acting as a paramilitary force, and the Navy are used to scale the response depending on who one is dealing with. So someone from Southeast Asia said against Japan, an ally of the United States, they send unarmed fishermen. Against the Philippines, they send the Coast Guard, and against Vietnam, they send the PLA Navy. So depending on the risk of escalation, one can use different tools as an integrated approach. So I would fully concur with Alessio to see it that way. The Coast Guard has received some units that are incredibly large. So large destroyer size units that are also very heavily armed, I think 10,000 tons, full displacement. And also they have made a corvette design for the PLA Navy that has also been adapted as a Coast Guard alternative, you could say. So the same platforms being built for the Navy and the Coast Guard, just equipped differently. So that is a huge dynamism in this development, definitely. And what worries me a bit is this new law that gives basically the Coast Guard permission to use force against intruders in what China defines as its maritime space, its maritime territory, despite the fact that a lot of that territory is actually disputed and not recognized by international law. It has so far as I know, not been utilized in a sense to bring this into a public, notice. But this is an indication of an intent to enforce maritime territory ideas, even with using force against a weaker power, despite not being in alignment with international law. So in that sense, I'm definitely worried about the trajectory that the Coast Guard development has been taking.
Thanks very much. I am going to squeeze in one last little teaser, actually, for the Admiral and the General, because I think it's an important question. It's from Nicholas Granholm, who's with the FII in Sweden, and it's in connection with the Ukraine war, and it's basically, and it'd be nice to know if you've been thinking about this, but how do you see the possibility or the feasibility of some kind of freedom of navigation operation to reopen seaborne trade through the Black Sea, given the significance of that and food supplies and issues of shortages in the Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere? Could that be done? And if so, how?
So just to reassure, of course we're thinking about it, and there are lots and lots of levels to it. Clearly, there's a huge conversation with international partners, starting at that level, not least Turkey and other Black Sea state partners that actually the Ministry of the Armed Forces outlined. So there's a real conversation with them as you go forward. And so that actually has to sort of essentially set the diplomatic and architecture and playbook with particularly the going through the Bosphorus. Then there are a number of ways and thought processes that you could play through this. But the thoughts that we are having at the moment, or the conversations that are ongoing, is that this has to absolutely be as multinational as possible. It has to have a clear humanitarian approach to it, which has to be telegraphed if the international community chose to do it, has to be telegraphed very, very clearly in terms of that activity. And then there are obviously the operational and tactical views of floating sea mines, how actually the battle space and the water space unfolds to try and work that through with the relevant capabilities within such a freedom of navigation activity that one would think about. So there's lots of layers to it, but it is a conversation that is ongoing. But as I say, it will be something the international community would have to decide to do.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. That's very good way to end up, and thank you for engaging with that question. It's been a very an excellent session and an excellent morning, I think. Forgive me for encroaching on the lunch period as I have, but I think it was worth it. We are about to break for lunch, but I would just make a couple of points before thanking the panelists. One of which is during the lunch period, both for the audience here, but also online, there will be a number of video conversations that will be playing on issues that are central, themes that are central to the conference, with discussants from Babcock, BAE and Rolls-Royce to give some of their perspectives on some of these issues. That, as I say, they'll be available on screen here and online during the lunch period. For lunch, there will be lunch served at the back of this room here, but also on the 4th floor in the council room to spread the load a bit. And given that I'm squeezing your lunch period, it might mean that some of you, if you try in the council room and spread out around the two locations, you'll get lunch and the opportunity to network more effectively. I would like to return from the lunch at the scheduled time for our next session, which is at 13:45. But as we break up, I would encourage you to express appreciation for what I think has been a very good session, and thank you for your engagement, but particularly appreciation for the panelists in the traditional manner. Thank you very much.